Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am very happy to be joined by an old friend, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be back with you, to see you again after my time in college, your time in graduate school over 25 years ago. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and it's great to reconnect with you.
Absolutely. And it was fun to start seeing this famous doctor who keeps showing up in the news all the time. And I knew you when you were just an undergraduate at Notre Dame, living in the Opus Dei Center nearby. And, and then all of a sudden I saw a few years ago, you had this great book come out, The Catholic Guide to Depression, published with Sophia Institute Press, how the saints, the sacraments, and psychiatry can help you break its grip and find happiness again. And it's funny, I wanted to have you on the show when I saw that book, but I didn't get around to it. And then all of a sudden, I started noticing that your name was popping up all over the place with these lawsuits you were having about COVID. And you ended up, getting fired from the University of California, Irving?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, where you had been the director of I think you were the director of the ethics committee and had been a full professor and a teaching fellow, right, in their medical school?
Yeah, that's right. I was a professor in the School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and director of their medical ethics program. I had been at the university actually for 16 years as a faculty member, 20 years if you count my residency training, which I also did at UC Irvine. And the story there was at the beginning of COVID, as director of medical ethics at UCI, I was placed on a committee at the Office of the President that oversaw not just UCI, but all the 5 of the UC branch campuses that had hospitals. And we were developing COVID policies, including policies that were ethically sensitive. So, for example, there was some concern early in the pandemic, what might happen if we run out of a scarce resource like ventilators? The supply it doesn't match the demand. How do we triage a scarce resource like that? Very difficult ethical policy question. So we hammered out a policy for that. We hammered out a policy for the allocation of monoclonal antibodies when those were scarce early in the pandemic. And then the university's vaccine mandate sort of came down from on high. And that committee that had worked on all the other policies for COVID was not really consulted, was not involved in the drafting of that policy. And I was troubled by that because it was quite obvious to me that of all the policies we had developed, the vaccine mandate was going to be the most publicly and ethically controversial because it bypassed or overrode the principle of informed consent, which for me was one of the most basic ethical principles. I taught the required ethics course to the medical students during their first and second year of med school. And lecture 2 is on the principle of informed consent, which goes back to the Nuremberg Code, which was a response to the atrocities committed by Nazi doctors during World War II and the Nuremberg trials. And I thought it was troubling that for the sake of, even for the sake of public health, we were tossing this principle overboard. I thought we need to have a conversation about this before we force a novel medical product on people who may or may not want it, may or may not need it. So I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal with Professor Jerry Bradley of Notre Dame Law School, arguing the university vaccine mandates were unethical because they violated the principle of informed consent. We already knew at this point that these products, these COVID shots, did not stop or prevent infection and transmission. So the whole kind of social solidarity argument, do it for the sake of others. You may be young and healthy and not at significant risk of COVID yourself, but you should get the shot for the sake of others. I thought that was an extraordinarily weak argument given what we knew empirically about these particular vaccines, if you even want to call them that. So we made that case publicly. I passed the article around the committee and the Office of the President, trying to use that to get a conversation going, and was sort of stonewalled and met with radio silence. But since I had gone public, people at the university then started reaching out to me and saying, I'm going to lose my scholarship and get kicked out of school. I have conscientious objections to this vaccine, but I'm not a religious person. And so I don't feel like in good conscience I can submit a religious exemption. I mean, this is a person who's being very conscientious and sort of trying to behave in a morally upright way. A lot of people found or rediscovered religious convictions in order to submit religious exemptions, and I don't necessarily fault them for that. But I had nurses reaching out to me who had worked on the front lines of the pandemic every day, had worked there for decades, who are going to lose their job because they didn't want to take the shot. So I decided, given my position as director of medical ethics, and projecting ahead to when I was going to teach the ethics course in January, and just trying to imagine standing up in front of the students and talking about the principle of informed consent, talking about moral courage and doing the right thing, even under pressure, even when it's hard. And I think I would have felt like something of a fraud if I didn't actually not just criticize the policy publicly, but do something to try to change the policy. So I took the fateful step of challenging the university's vaccine mandate in federal court. And I like to tell people, if you want to go sideways with your employer really quickly, a very efficient way to do that is to sue them in federal court. So the university wasted no time in getting rid of me. They immediately placed me, even before the court made its ruling in my case. I was placed on so-called investigatory leave, then on unpaid suspension a month after that, and then a month later I was fired in short order. And that case became, something of it was covered by the media. It was a bit of a headline. University ethics professor gets fired for challenging the ethics of the university's policy. Was a headline in the LA Times and elsewhere. And so I got sort of caught up after that in the medical freedom movement, for lack of a better term, and also got involved in the issue of free speech and government censorship, because something else very strange happened during that time. And that was after I filed the lawsuit, but before I was fired, I did my first interview, which was with a former CBS journalist named Allison Morrow. And she had left journalism, but had a podcast on the side that she just did out of her home. And she was working for the state of Washington Department of Natural Resources at the time. And so we had a conversation, not even about safety and efficacy of the vaccines. I was not criticizing these products. I was certainly not telling people that they should or shouldn't get them. I was just talking about the ethical principle of informed consent. And I was talking about legal issues that I thought were relevant for vaccine mandates. So purely sort of ethical, legal, philosophical conversation. Was censored on YouTube. Her account was suspended. And shortly after I got fired, her employer, the state of Washington, told her, if you don't take that podcast down from the other platforms where it's still posted, we're going to fire you. And she, for better or worse, refused to take it down, and she was fired. So within the span of like a few weeks, I lost my job for saying things that I had been teaching the medical students for 20 years that I thought were very uncontroversial. And the first person I talked to, the conversation was censored by big tech. And then that person was also fired simply for having a conversation with me about it. So it was kind of a dizzying, surreal experience. And, a few weeks later, I find myself standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with a crowd of 40,000 people gathered for the Defeat the Mandates rally, with RFK Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya, who's now head of the NIH, and, many of these other COVID dissidents who are now actually in positions of considerable authority. And I'm giving a talk to this crowd gathered in the 20-degree freezing cold weather. And, I look down to my right, and I see a plaque on the marble steps that says, MLK 1964, I have a dream speech. And it was just surreal what am I doing here? And what what has happened to me? And the next day I testified to the United States Senate on these issues at a hearing that Senator Ron Johnson had sponsored. So my life changed very quickly. And I was rescued by some independent think tanks, most notably the Ethics and Public Policy Center. My friend Ryan Anderson wrote a beautiful piece in Newsweek after I was fired saying that, he personally, because of his pre-existing medical condition and consultation with his physician, he decided to get the COVID vaccine. I decided not to get the COVID vaccine. He respects my decision. I respect his decision. And, he said, basically, we at the EPPC stand behind Dr. Kheriaty's defense of the principle of informed consent. So he brought me on and gave me a job so I could continue doing my research and writing and public policy work in medical ethics. And I also got some support from the Brownstone Institute and Jeffrey Tucker, who put together this institute, which is kind of a collection of people like me who were pummeled or punished for challenging the government's preferred pandemic policies. So my life changed very quickly at the end of, it would have been the end of, 2021, beginning of 2022. And I got a phone call from, I like to call him my second brother-in-law once removed, a man named John Sauer, who's married to my brother's wife's sister. So I knew John from the family connection. And he at the time was Solicitor General of Missouri. The Solicitor General is sort of the lead litigator in the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General is sort of a political figurehead. He walks into the courtroom from time to time and sprinkles holy water on the proceedings. But the guy actually arguing cases before, the state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be the Solicitor General. So John is a brilliant litigator. And at the time, the state of Missouri was going to file a lawsuit along with the state of Louisiana against the federal government for pressuring social media companies to censor. So he asked me, he said, "You've been censored, right?" And I explained the story of Alison Morrow and some other examples of being censored. And he said, "Well, we have reason to believe now that it wasn't just the big tech companies that were doing this, and we can have ethical and legal debates about whether big tech companies should be able to censor in that fashion. But no one should doubt that the federal government can't do that. The federal government can't coerce or pressure social media companies to censor. That's a clear violation of our constitutional First Amendment free speech rights." And so he brought me on board and he asked me if I, as one of the private plaintiffs in the case, he asked me if I knew anyone else who had, credible doctors and scientists who had been censored. And so I reached out to Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, who's now at the CDC, but formerly was at Harvard and lost his job there for, publishing inconvenient data about COVID, basically. And so we filed this case called Missouri v. Biden. The case went to the Supreme Court. We got a preliminary injunction against the government. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not uphold it on a technicality related to standing, but the case continued to be litigated in federal court. And sort of the quick version of that case is the federal judge in that case said, if what plaintiffs allege is true, that the government was pressuring and coercing social media companies to censor, this is the worst free speech violation in United States history, because it wasn't a one-off, government official pressuring for one story to be suppressed in a newspaper or a magazine, or sort of a couple of paragraphs to be struck from a book that was being published or something like that. It was governments really forcing social media companies to change their algorithms and their terms of service such that hundreds of thousands of Americans were censored tens of millions of times. Starting around 2018, ramping up during the pandemic and after the 2020 election, and continuing potentially even today in some form. So because of the nature of digital technologies, we had just never had the tools to censor on such a massive scale. And so there was a federal judge that said this is potentially the worst violation of free speech in United States history. That wasn't one of the plaintiffs or one of our lawyers making that case. The government's settling that case now with us. So we're going to get some sort of at least partial victory. And what we're going for is, some watchdog mechanism to make sure there's transparency when the government communicates with social media companies on content, so-called content moderation, or on censorship. And it's worth mentioning, just close my brief summary of my legal adventures with this. It's worth mentioning that Elon Musk opened the backdoor channels of Twitter to some journalists, and the Twitter files, so-called Twitter files, were published around the same time that we were getting documents on discovery in our case, and basically confirmed what we saw in our case. Mark Zuckerberg went on Joe Rogan's podcast and said the government was pressuring us. We tried to resist. We eventually caved in and gave in, and we shouldn't have done that, and I'm sorry. And more recently, YouTube actually made the same admission in a letter to Jim Jordan, Congressman Jordan. So the CEOs of the companies have all admitted that this was happening, confirming exactly what we alleged in that case. So it's been a wild ride the last 4 years. From being just a university professor doing my thing in psychiatry and medical ethics, to getting swept up in public health policies related to pandemics, and then free speech and government censorship issues. And, God had some surprises in store for me, but it's been a lot of fun, and I've made a lot of new and interesting friends. And I've fortunately been able to continue my work with support from some really terrific independent research institutes. So I miss the teaching. I miss the students and the residents at the university, but God's given me some other opportunities since I left the university to continue work that I feel is important.
Wow, it's an amazing story, and thanks so much for walking us through it. Of course, I do have the thought. I'm wondering if, I guess, if this episode does not get censored, that will be a sign that your lawsuit was effective.
Exactly.
Right? So
things might be
proof.
changing.
Yeah, maybe they will be. And so you're now the director. You're a scholar and director of the program in Bioethics and American Democracy at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. So that's great to see. But I wanted to talk, especially today, this new book you have, Making the Cut: How to Heal Modern Medicine. Right. And so this just came out, I think, right? This is this year,
That's right.
2025, with Regnery Press. And right, it's kind of a fascinating story. It's a little bit of just your own journey through becoming becoming a medical student. You describe in some ways a little bit of that medical schools and being a resident is not all, it's not all good, right? There's some problems with it. You describe a little bit of some kind of, a little bit of a dehumanizing effect between the doctors and the patients. When I was reading it, the one thought I had is that, well, I had countless thoughts. I have lots of notes, but just one thought I wanted to ask you a little bit about was, it seems to me that, if you're doing surgery, okay, you kind of want to really be a little detached from some aspects of your patient, so you're not overly emotionally distracted during the surgery, right?
That's right.
That makes sense to me. I don't want to cut open myself. I don't want to cut open anyone else. I have a natural revulsion to that. I do understand if I'm going to have surgery, I have to have some people that are comfortable doing things that they have to overcome that, right? But it seems to me that there's a huge range of medical practice and medical health, right? I mean, from your work in psychiatry to so many other things that we need doctors to do to really learn to care for patients and help patients heal. It almost seems like everything is oriented to the kind of surgical model of dissecting the patient. And you even talk a little bit about you have a chapter in here called The Patient Corpse, where the ideal patient becomes the anatomy, right? The course in the anatomy lab,
which involves a corpse, right?
Yeah.
So, in a sense, at the very beginning of the first year of medical school, typically is where you do gross anatomy lab. We call it gross anatomy lab, not just because it's gross, but meaning large anatomy visible with the naked eye. We also have a course in microscopic anatomy, the stuff you put under the microscope.
Wow.
So you have the anatomy lab where you dissect a dead body, which in a sense is your first patient. But it's a patient that's totally, well, first of all, that's dead. And a dead body, it turns out, looks and functions very little like a living human body. You later learn when you do surgery on the wards. But also, it's a body that's totally decontextualized. You know nothing about whether it's a man or a woman, but you know nothing about even the age at death. You know nothing about the patient's history, personal history, social history, familial context. And so you take this static knowledge of the dead body that you gain from gross anatomy lab, and then you later try to overlay it on the dynamic living human body that exists in a social context, that exists in a familial context, that has a personal history, that has a soul, right? For lack of a better word. And I argue in the book that in some sense, this gets things backwards, and that the effects of doing medical training in this way shapes the imagination of the developing physician and of the medical student, and encourages a kind of materialist, mechanistic understanding of the human body as a sort of assemblage or collection of parts, rather than as a unified whole, a unified organism. And then that subsequently shapes the practice of modern mainstream medicine in ways that, in some contexts, it's fine to think about the human body, at least as a model, as broken parts that need to be fixed. So if, God forbid, Michael, you get hit by a truck tomorrow, go to the emergency room and let the trauma surgeons patch you back together. We're very good in contemporary medicine at dealing with acute illness and acute trauma, and kind of let's open up the hood, and you've got a ruptured aneurysm. We're gonna repair it, right? And I have a story in chapter 1, a harrowing, actually, I think, beautiful story about saving a man's life when he ruptured his aorta, the largest vessel in the body, which is typically fatal, but in this case, we were able to save him. So I love medicine, and it's the book, in a sense, is a love story, but it's also a love story that is a somewhat of a tragedy, because I feel like my lover has turned prostitute of late. that there's medicine itself has become sick, and this idea of treating the body as a kind of machine or inert mechanism can be helpful in a few narrowly defined contexts, like the ones I just mentioned. But in most other medical contexts, it actually becomes dehumanizing. And patients sort of sense it. They sort of feel it. They go into the hospital, they go into the clinic, or they accompany a loved one, a family member in that context, and they feel like they're being processed by some kind of industrial machine that is focused more on efficiency than on health and healing. And that certainly doesn't treat them as a unique individual whose care needs to be personalized, right? So, your doctor is staring at a computer screen, checking boxes and asking you questions, most of which have nothing to do with your chief complaint. He's become a sort of glorified data entry clerk for an electronic medical record system that was not designed for patient care, but was designed for data gathering and data analysis. And you're sort of wondering when he's going to come and talk to you face to face and maybe like put his hands on you and examine you. And so I think many people today sense that something has gone wrong in the house of medicine. That's why so many complementary and alternative forms of medical care have sprung up to try to fill that vacuum. I think that's what's behind the so-called MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again wing of the current administration. that's trying to draw our attention, I think rightfully so, to the chronic disease epidemic that we're suffering from. Right, we spend twice as much on healthcare in this country as any other developed nation in the world, and our overall health outcomes are barely in the top 50 among
You
countries
mentioned
around the world.
in your book that since 2014, or in 2014, the U.S. lifespan, right, on average begins to decline.
Yeah, that's
You
right.
know, and I think that's continued.
That's
So,
right. And
yeah.
that's, you can argue about this or that disease. Are we making enough progress on cancer and heart disease or not? But you can't argue with all-cause mortality. The total number of bodies in the ground. Age-adjusted mortality is a statistic that does not lie. And, average lifespan of a citizen in the United States is a statistic that does not lie. And so,
I think, one thing
that's
that's
a
really
clear indication that we're not doing well, and that can't all be laid at the feet of medicine. I mean, some of these problems are, have to do with environmental toxins and our food supply and things that are outside of the control of most physicians. But medicine has also, I argue in the book, contributed to the problem, or at least not done enough to address the problem.
Yeah. And so this idea of dehumanization, it's not, I mean, it is a moral concern, right? Of not seeing the person as a person. But ironically, it's a medical concern because it just turns out I'm a unique kind of organism that's alive and everything's interconnected. And when you look at me as parts, it just doesn't, it doesn't really work. A lot of this, I mean, in some ways, this goes back to, Rene Descartes' discourse on method, where he actually says, that we'll make medicine the highest science, and we will become masters and possessors of nature when we follow his practical philosophy. And his philosophy is to treat this mind as a thinking thing and the body as an extended thing. And so it's just a machine. That's what he says. And it's developed so much over, especially in the 20th century and the 21st century. But when we look at things as parts, we just go to a specialist here, a specialist there, a specialist there. But I don't get somebody who really looks at me as a whole. And I'm not experiencing chronic suffering today, but I do have loved ones who are. It's not only that they're not helped, it's that I don't know that anyone is really looking at their overall situation. And this is the irony is somebody who would just go visit them in their house would immediately see so much, right, that they would begin to say, wait a second, okay, like it's not just run another test. It's that I have to really look at the person in order to offer good medical care. So, I want to, we're coming up on our break, so we're going to break for 30 seconds. But when we get back, I really want to just dive in a little bit to this. You wrote a whole book on this topic, right? And it tells your story. But I love the way that you talk about how to heal modern medicine. So this is kind of looking at modern medicine as a patient, offering a diagnosis and trying to come up with a holistic remedy. So I want to look at a couple of the problems that exist and, a little bit of how they might be healed.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
You really tell the story in many ways of your own journey as a medical student, resident, doctor. You go on to become a psychiatrist, right? And yet at the same time, you kind of notice, or you're describing this increasing mechanistic approach, this treating the body merely as a machine, which, as you note, is very effective for treating acute problems like maybe a broken femur, but not that good at treating chronic conditions of, chronic pain and these sorts of things. Part of the, the opioid crisis is at least in part related to the throwing painkillers at people because doctors didn't have any other resources. One of the things you describe, two quotes that really struck me, but I'll start with one. Ivan Ilyich in, I think it was on page 75 of your book, but you write this: the intensive care is but the culmination of public worship around a medical priesthood struggling against death. So what's going on there? This public worship about a medical priesthood struggling against death.
Yeah. So I argue in the chapter on death and dying that medicine really hasn't come to terms with death and learned how to deal with it effectively. So there is a push within medicine that goes all the way back to the founders of the modern scientific enterprise. You mentioned Rene Descartes, but you could mention Francis Bacon. Knowledge is power. Specifically, he meant power over nature. And he also talked about the scientific enterprise being oriented toward medicine. And if medicine understands itself to be fighting death as the last enemy to be conquered, then it's going to lose in every case. Because in spite of whatever wonderful advances we've made in modern medicine, and there have been real advances, I'm a big fan of anesthesia. I don't want to go back to the days of the Civil War where, we had limbs amputated without general anesthesia. I'm a big fan of antibiotics, even if they're becoming less effective through overuse and breeding treatment-resistant bugs. But in spite of all these great advances, the human mortality rate continues to hold steady at 100%, right? So all of our patients eventually are going to die of something. And so medicine is practiced to get against that horizon of death. And in fact, every illness that we treat and every broken bone that we treat is a subtle reminder of our frailty and our mortality. But I would say large segments of medicine, and you see this both in mainstream medicine and a more extreme version of this in the so-called transhumanist movement, is aimed at radical life extension to the point of eventually being able to, replace our parts to the point where we can literally live forever, right? Or upload the contents of our consciousness into the mainframe computer in the cloud, or some other Gnostic dualist dream. But the idea that we can conquer death through science and technology, I think is, I think transhumanism is a religion. It's a sort of ersatz religion for a secular age, right? The desire to live forever is a religious desire, and it's hard to eradicate that from the human heart. As Catholics, we believe that death was not part of the original plan. It was a consequence of the fall, a consequence of original sin. But the solution to that is the cross, which I think we might be talking about in the next episode. But many people want to say, well, maybe the solution is technical, and maybe we can fight against death at all costs. And medicine, I think, operates best when it recognizes its inherent limits. And we've made some progress with the development of the specialty of palliative care in helping people at the very last stage of life and in caring for them while they are dying. But the fact that we needed a separate medical specialty to do what all physicians actually should be trained to do, oncologists who treat cancer, who have many patients who die, for example, ideally shouldn't need palliative care physicians to accompany their patients to the very end. And in fact, many patients resent being abandoned by their oncologist and handed off to a palliative care doctor that they only just met, simply because there are no other curative or life-extending treatment options available. So I argue in that chapter 2 that there's two things that are being pushed within medicine that on the face of it look like opposites, but actually are flip sides of the same coin. And the first of those is the push for doctor-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Assisted suicide has been legalized in my home state of California, where I practice medicine, and in a handful of other states. And of course, the euthanasia regime has gone very far in Canada, and is quite well advanced there. And both of these are attempts to exercise technical mastery over the one event in our life that most fully reminds us of our lack of complete mastery and control, of the fact that we're not the sole author of the story of our life, which is death. The idea that we can control death by controlling the timing and circumstances of our death, I think, is a strange fantasy. I can exercise my autonomy by eliminating the basis for my autonomy, by destroying myself, is a very strange notion, but it seems to be embraced by large segments of medicine and society today. There's another thing that you see very frequently in contemporary medicine, in the practice of medicine in the ICU especially, which, for lack of a better term, I'll call therapeutic obstinacy. The idea of extending life at all costs, even when those intensive, burdensome interventions do not promise any sort of meaningful recovery, any sort of holistic or functional recovery, just keeping someone on a ventilator indefinitely and prolonging the dying process without commensurate benefit. That's something that some physicians are inclined to do. Many family members are inclined to do. And again, that inability to accept the limits of medicine, to accept death when it's inevitable, and to allow natural death is, I argue, while it may look like the opposite of euthanasia, like we're trying to keep the patient alive, we're not trying to kill the patient, they're actually flip sides of the same coin, because it's the same fantasy that we can completely control death through science and technology. So medicine is always tempted by hubris, by a kind of the kind of rhetoric that you see again in Francis Bacon and René Descartes and the contemporary transhumanists, that we can be masters of nature and conquerors of the human condition, that we can refashion and remake human nature, and even at the end conquer death if only we put enough technical and financial resources toward that project. And I think that project, because it's based on basically false philosophical and metaphysical premises, is not only doomed to failure, but it ends up producing the opposite of what its proponents claim. Not only does it not enhance human life, it ends up becoming dehumanizing. And many of those trends are endemic in contemporary medicine and infecting not all of, but significant portions of the contemporary medical establishment.
Yeah, you speak in that same chapter of, well, I think, and you're quoting Ivan Ilyich there, but the medicalization of death and then the medicalization of society. And unfortunately, we are going to die. And it would be great to kind of somehow have a little bit of dying well, right? Even the Stoics spoke about dying well. Socrates described philosophy as the preparation for death. But right now, we don't prepare for death. We don't talk about it. It was interesting during the entire COVID pandemic. I don't know if you ever heard anyone say, make a will. Did anybody ever say, like, you might die, so get your affairs in order, make a will, set up a trust, go to confession, get ready for death. Everyone's like, no, we're just going to outsmart it. They're like, well, that's just, it's an absurd claim, but it's our knee-jerk reaction. And ironically, then we ended up with a lot of people who did die at various points, and they died, or if they died in the hospitals, they died alone. I think, to my knowledge, I don't know of a single other time, there may be some, but when we did not allow priests, when we used the force of the law and the force of the state to prevent priests from offering anointing of the sick. So family members could not accompany the dying. And in some ways, this is, I think, that's not surprising, because that's all what we're doing anyway. Who's going to determine who gets to see the patient who's dying? The doctors. Instead of, well, what about the patient? The patient and the family members might be able to make those claims. And, so I just think there's a lot about that question. This medicalization of death falls into this medicalization of society. That's right. But the doctors aren't really even, they're forced to bear weights that they really were not trained to bear. I don't look at this in any sense as, and I didn't get any of your sense of like, this is a critical view of doctors. It's really offering understanding and compassion to doctors who are often, sometimes have been badly formed and sometimes are operating within constraints where they're really limited by the incentives and systems in which they operate.
No, thank you for bringing that up. It's a societal critique as much as it's a critique of physicians or of institutional medicine for the reasons that you mentioned. I mean, shame on Catholics and on the clergy for acquiescing to not being able to give the sacraments to dying people during COVID, right? There were people in the hospital. There were doctors and nurses taking appropriate precautions and wearing personal protective equipment and getting screened and so on and so forth. Priests should have been standing at the doors of the hospital saying, we're not leaving until you open these doors, because there's people in there that are dying, that need spiritual care more than they need medical care, actually, because the soul is more important than the body. We actually believe that as Catholics. And this person's eternal salvation is more important than their biological health. And we'll take whatever precautions you tell us to do. We'll jump through whatever hoops the doctors and nurses and x-ray techs on the other side of these doors are doing. But we're not leaving here until you open these doors. And the bishops and the priests and the laity should have been demanding that during the pandemic, because you're right. To my knowledge, there's no other point in human history where this has happened. And in fact, during much more deadly plagues, the church were with much higher infection fatality rates than COVID. The church always ministered to the sick. And there's beautiful examples in Catholic history. The great Italian novel, The Beloved, Manzoni, describes this during one of the plagues in northern Italy. Beautiful story that includes both cowardly but also brave priests ministering to the sick during the plague. So this is part of our tradition. This is part of our history that we totally abandoned during COVID. And Catholics gave into, by and large, this notion that bare biological life was the highest human good. And we placed that above other human goods, spiritual goods, familial goods, being there to hold the hand of my loved one while they are dying, and recognizing that that's more important than some misguided attempt at infection control. Most people don't know there was a period of time where the CDC refused to allow the burial of people who had died of COVID. They were requiring cremation over against the objection of family members on the ludicrous assumption that had no basis in any study or previous infectious disease that maybe a dead body can spread this virus. And we acquiesced to it. I mean, so there was a kind of insanity that took over that I think was driven by, at a deep psychological level, a fear and denial of death. And a society that does not have any hope of eternal life, I think, is going to be prone to give in to that kind of denial, which will lead to some really quite insane behaviors and to dehumanizing social practices that abandon people in the most important moments. So I cited in that chapter my friend Ira Byock, who's a palliative care physician in Los Angeles, who wrote a beautiful book called The 4 Things That Matter Most in the End. And this is a palliative care physician writing about treating dying patients. And the 4 things that matter most turn out not to be morphine or lorazepam or, things to control symptoms. Those are important, right? Pain control and very important at the end of life. But he said the most important things are the conversations where people say, thank you, I forgive you, please forgive me, I love you, right? That is healing. That may be more healing than morphine and lorazepam or another experimental round of chemotherapy. So medicine has to recognize its limits, but this is not just a problem to be laid at the feet of doctors and nurses. It's a societal problem that medicine is, let's say, is sort of cooperating in this delusion that we can beat death through science and technology, but the church has a role in reminding people of these higher truths, and that there are higher goods, that there are things that are literally worth giving up your life for, that it may be actually worth risking your life, risking getting an infectious disease in order to give the sacraments to a dying person. And in fact, there have been priests throughout Catholic history who have done that and died, essentially, you could say, martyrs, died out of exercising a beautiful form of charity for their fellow man.
Carl Adam, who was a early 20th century Catholic theologian, influential on Ratzinger, later Benedict, he wrote a book called The Spirit of Catholicism. Beautiful book on just the fullness, the whole God, the whole Christ, the whole church. But one of the things he mentions in there, he says that after he wrote it in, I think it was 1921, and he said that, or at least it was in the 20s, and he said that after World War I, there was a conversion, there was a movement of conversion of many Europeans to Catholicism. And he says it was because the Catholic priests would go into the trenches, right, to hear confessions, to give, anointing of the sick to the dying, and because they had to be physically present and at their cost. And I think, military chaplains do this a lot. By the way, military people, like, the point is, a lot of people are called to offer, to sacrifice. I think every mother who's pregnant, right? It's, it's mortal combat, so to speak, getting through birth, and not everybody makes it. I mean, there's this, we can't have a society without courage. And Aquinas will say in his treatment of courage and temperance, right? Courage is the virtue that allows us to do the good even when we feel fear, do the hard thing even when we feel fear. And temperance, of course, is that which helps us to, or self-control, moderate our desires for pleasures. But he says we need courage more than temperance, because he says the fear of suffering and death is more blinding to the good of reason than the desire for pleasure. And in some ways, I think, we spend a lot of time, hopefully, we need to remind people that, giving into the desires, to the sexual appetites, to the desires for drink, and all of these sorts of things are not going to make you happy and are going to make you less happy and more enslaved over time. But it's also, and probably even more the case, that giving into fear is going, and it's opposite, which is the same opposite side, the same kind of, like, rage and anger. That's actually going to make you even more enslaved over time. So could you talk a little bit, as a Catholic, as a psychiatrist, how do we recover courage, resilience, grit, as it's sometimes called these days, this fundamental virtue of courage that you've noted is lacking at times? How do we do that, maybe as persons, but also as, doctors and the medical community?
Yeah. Well, gosh, that was so well put. Thank you for that. I'm still thinking about those priests going into the trenches in World War I. I mean, that's more credible than any sermon you could preach, right? That's how you give witness, and that's what moves people. And gosh, the missed opportunities that Catholics had during the pandemic, for bishops and priests to say, you can live stream mass and stay home if you're worried, if you're elderly or frail or at high risk of bad outcomes from COVID. But if you're young and healthy, and you're willing to assume those risks, the doors of our church are open. Imagine if the doors of the Catholic Church remained open, and obviously, we can't receive the sacraments over Zoom. We can make spiritual communions, but to remind people that the reception of Holy Communion, that the reception of a face-to-face sacramental confession can only be done in person. And we're going to continue to do that. Imagine how many Protestant Christians would have flocked to Catholic churches if they were the only churches open during the pandemic. So gosh, what a missed opportunity. How do we find our courage? I would say, I would begin by citing St. Josemaria Escriva, who said that all our fortitude is on loan. In other words, if you look at the courage of the martyrs, if you look at the courage of the saints, let's take St. Lawrence as a prototypical example of a martyr, whether the story is real or apocryphal about what he said while he was being roasted on the gridiron. It's undoubtable that he exhibited enormous courage, whatever happened to that moment. But the story goes, so he was a deacon of the early church, and the emperor demanded that he bring all the riches of the church, lay it at the emperor's feet. And he brought in the poor people and said, here are the riches of the church. The emperor didn't think that was very funny, so he decided to barbecue him to death. Literally, he was roasted on a gridiron. And the story goes that in the middle of this obviously gruesome ordeal, he says, "You can turn me over. I'm done on this side." Right. So it's cracking a joke while he's being tormented. So whether it's St. Lawrence or one of the other martyrs, St. Isaac Jogues, who was tortured by North American natives and so forth, St. Joan of Arc, it's not necessarily that these people were by temperament or even by natural virtue braver than the rest of us. It's that they were madly in love with Jesus Christ. It's that, as we'll talk about, I hope in the next episode, they learned Christ's passion, Christ's suffering. That is meditating on that, going to the sacraments, contemplating the crucifix. That's where we find our courage. Some people are naturally brave and physically courageous, but that doesn't mean that they demonstrate moral courage. They may make tough soldiers, which is a great thing. They may make sort of gritty athletes, which is a great thing, but they can be cowards when it comes to doing the right thing under pressure, giving into what are other people going to think of me, sort of considerations about human respect. And I still remember one of the things that my father told me, which is encouraging to all fathers who think their teenage sons don't listen to them. I remember I must have been 15 years old, driving in the car with my father. And at the time, I was kind of getting into like dangerous thrill-seeking activities. So we used to go cliff jumping at this place. I lived in Bellingham, at Bellingham Bay. There's a place you could jump from a pretty high cliff into the water, which is a stupid thing to do, actually. And my father told me something that I've never forgotten. He said, courage is not doing reckless things. Courage is doing the right thing, even when it's difficult and even when it will cost you something. And I think that kind of spiritual courage, that kind of supernatural courage, ultimately is a gift of grace. So I think we have to ask for it. If all of our fortitude is on loan, we have to pray to God, please loan me some more fortitude. And then we have to avail ourselves of the means of grace, which are prayer and the sacraments, to try to grow in that virtue. I mean, you know more about Aquinas certainly than I do, but I did read a bit of the Summa in college, including the treatise on the virtues. And if I recall, Aquinas says all of the natural virtues, all of the cardinal virtues, like fortitude, like courage, have their supernatural counterpart. And their supernatural counterpart goes beyond what we would ever be capable of through our own willpower alone. And that is a gift of grace. And I think that is the kind of courage that we really need today. And that's something that only God can give us.
Yeah. And in some ways, it's the courage we can demonstrate when we admit that we are cowards. Like we have to just be honest. Lewis even has a line. Right. Lewis has a line in Screwtape Letters, letter 29, on courage and cowardice. But he says, he basically says, many people discovered the moral world in the First World War when they discovered their cowardice. Like when we actually can admit, oh, you too gave into fear. Oh, okay. Like, and when we finally admit that we haven't lived up to the demands of courage, then we actually admit our need, that I actually can't, I need God's help and mercy, because I actually on my own, right, am not as good as I pretend. So, we are coming up to the end of our time. I just got to ask you one, like if you could in 30 seconds or a minute, the last chapter is To the Wonder. And I think there's kind of a beautiful thing that you talk a little bit about, this idea of like a crisis is both is in the Greek is actually a turning point in the in the patient's illness. And so again, you're trying to not just condemn, but to heal modern medicine. And you kind of end by talking about we need to recover kind of the wonder of medicine and a kind of gratitude for medicine. So could you talk a little bit about that, but briefly?
Yeah, thank you for that question. You're right. The word crisis, the etymological Greek word, originally referred to the point in the illness in which either the patient declined and died or the patient turned the corner and made a recovery. And so when I say there's a crisis in medicine, medicine can kind of go in one of two directions. And I'd like to offer a hopeful counsel that it can recover its original vocation. And at the center of that has to be respect for the doctor-patient relationship and sufficient discretionary latitude for physicians so that they can practice medicine according to sort of their original Hippocratic commitments without that being undermined by all these external forces. And I still think that's possible. I think patients want it. They're hungry for it. They will seek out doctors. There are some models of delivering care that I mentioned in the last chapter of the book that describe potential ways to do this. And there's creative minds out there that can come up with solutions that I and others have not thought of. So I think we should be hopeful that medicine can recover. And as Christians, as Roman Catholics, listeners of this podcast should remember that Christianity is a religion of healing, that our Lord did three things in his public ministry: preaching, teaching, and healing. And so we've always been in the business of healthcare from the beginning. Catholics invented the hospital. The first hospitals were in monasteries caring for poor people that couldn't afford private physicians. And so this is part of our tradition. This is part of what we as Christians are called to do. And it's actually sharing in our Lord's own ministry of healing. And so I'm optimistic, not because of not because of the contemporary landscape, but because of God's providence in history. And because illness is universal and it can afflict anyone. It's the great equalizer, rich, poor, famous or obscure. Everyone is vulnerable to illness. And I think a society won't continue very long if it can't trust the people that it designates to heal. And so I think we're seeing now a push for reforms in medicine and public health. And I'm cautiously optimistic and hopeful that we'll be able to make improvements. And hopefully, this little book making the cut can offer some ideas in that regard.
Yeah, and there's so many. We could have, I think, half a dozen more podcasts episodes just going through your book and all the different issues. You talk at various points about this managerialist ideology, the money interests of the trials and the pharmaceutical companies, this utopian progressivism, this homogenizing universalism, right? All these other things, and certainly the money and the process behind the somewhat this standardization, but also really a very narrow vision that has taken place in the 20th and 21st century are all very important. But we are at the end. We're coming up to the end of our show, and I want to ask you three questions. So, Aaron, Dr. Kheriaty, what's a book you're reading?
I've been reading some of the ancient desert fathers, which I never really got into until now. A friend recommended that I dig into it a little bit. And it's fascinating because they have amazing insights into human psychology. I'm a layman living in the middle of the world. These were people that in the early centuries of the church sort of fled the world to find God in the desert. So in my mind, it was always like, well, they have a different vocation than mine, so I don't have too much to learn from them. But I think lay people do have something to learn from the desert fathers So I read recently Mark the Monk, and then a collection of sayings from some of the other Desert Fathers. And one of the interesting things they have to teach us is, as they fled the noise of the world and sought God in silence and solitude, which is something I think all of us need in our lives, even and especially when we're living and working in the middle of the world as lay people. We need periods and times every day and every month and every year of silence and solitude, that the noise of their own interior mind sort of rose up, and the desert became a mirror for them to see not just the chaos in the world, but the chaos inside of them. And so that's a lesson that I think all of us can take from the Desert Fathers. How do we turn off our screens and carve out time for contemplative prayer, maybe a silent retreat every year, so that we can kind of contend with the interior noise that has built up that we don't even notice anymore because, as Pascal said, all of modern man's problems stem from the fact that he can't sit alone in a room for 30 minutes, right? So we need to learn how to do that. And so I'm enjoying learning from the Desert Fathers, and it sort of surprised me a little bit how relevant what they have to say is.
That's great. That almost kind of begins to answer the second question. But can you pick just one spiritual practice you do on a regular basis that helps you find meaning and purpose and grow closer to Christ?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I try to take 3 minutes and examine my conscience and ask myself just 3 simple questions. And this can take 3 or 4 minutes. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. But, what did I do well today? What did I not do well? Where did I mess up? Is make a mental note of anything I need to mention in my next confession. And what can I try to do better tomorrow, and maybe make a specific resolution? If I messed up in a particular area, I want to make a point of sort of trying to get that right tomorrow. And, whether my day went well or my day went badly, whether I, engaged in my other spiritual resolutions that day, or I neglected them, I can try to close the day well with a 3-minute examination of conscience, and then a little simple act of contrition, which can be as simple as the Jesus prayer: Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And whether you've had a good day or a bad day, I highly recommend a daily examination of conscience at the end, just to close things out. And if you do that regularly every day, it will help you grow. And I think it will help you make progress.
That's great. So this is a theology podcast. Theology matters. What we believe about God matters. What's a belief you held about God that you discovered later was false? And what was the truth you discovered?
So I think I would not have articulated this belief. Like, if you asked me if I believe this, I would have denied it intellectually. But I think in my heart and in my practice, and I'm still working on sort of eradicating this false belief from my own mind, is the belief that God loves me more when I perform well. That I somehow earn his approval, or the gold star, or the good behavior report, by being a successful professional. Now, on the one hand, we want to try to offer our work to God, which means we want to try to do it well. But there's a subtle temptation there of equating worldly success with spiritual success. And so I like to cite St. Jerome in this regard. A good priest friend of mine recently gave me a first-class relic of St. Jerome, which is hard to come by. And I treasure that because I love Jerome. He, as many people know, he had a kind of choleric temperament, and he didn't suffer fools gladly. And he had probably some temperamental faults that were fairly obvious. The saints are not porcelain figures; they're human beings of flesh and blood, and they had faults too. And he was a bit stubborn. He didn't want to translate the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament, the Greek books. The Council of Rome told him, when you translate the Vulgate, this is part of the canon of the scriptures, it's got to be in there. And he kind of kicked and screamed and publicly protested a little bit, but eventually he gave in. And so he had to overcome his own intellectual pride and his own kind of stubborn will. And toward the end of his life, he recognized that all of my intellectual gifts, any good thing that I have, whether on the natural level or on the supernatural level, was first given to me by God, that the only thing that I have to offer to God that is truly my own is my sin. The only thing that's 100% mine that I have to give to God is my sin, which is a humbling recognition. So I'm trying to learn that lesson that Jerome struggled to learn, and I'm trying to sort of undo this maybe unconsciously held belief that God's going to love me more if I'm successful in a worldly sense, or even if I appear successful in a spiritual sense, whatever that means. That he died for me precisely because I'm a sinner, precisely because I'm depraved, and that's very consoling, but also because of our own pride and our own vanity, I think it's a struggle to really know it in our heart and believe it.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. And again, we've been talking today with Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, who is the scholar at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and now the director of the program, I believe, in ethics, technology, and society, right? Or
Human flourishing.
Human flourishing. And we've been talking about his book, Making the Cut, How to Heal Modern Medicine, 2025 publication with Regnery Press. So thanks so much for being on the show. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.